Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Tamam Al-Audat. I am the CEO of the New Humanitarian. And today we are asking a question as we come closer to 2 years of the genocide in Gaza. And the question is, what should humanitarian actors do to stop the genocide in Gaza? This is a question that isn't usual. Today, actually, MSF, Doctors Without Borders, puts an image saying doctors don't stop genocides, governments do. Yet governments aren't stopping this genocide. And whether there is a moral responsibility or a feasibility of humanitarian actors doing something that goes beyond attempting to deliver aid and witnessing and beyond denunciation is what we are asking our participants to discuss today. I'm joined today, thank you to our colleagues, by Freddie Carver, who is the director of the Humanitarian Policy Group in ODI, Overseas Development Institute, Dr. Shahad Hamouri, a Palestinian Jordanian lecturer in international law and legal theory in the University of Kent, and Dr. Philip Proudfoot, a research fellow in the Institute of Development Studies and the co-founder of the Accountability Archives. We have had a confirmation from Dr. Halima Begum, the chief executive of Oxfam GB. However, she unfortunately had a delay in her travel and was unable to join us. So an apologies from her, and we would love to hear from her again. We are at the more than 23 months of a genocide that is live streamed and shown to us in the most grotesque details over the past 2 years. The least numbers we anticipate are the 65,000 people killed, and according to Israeli own leaked databases, more than 80% of those are civilians. We know that most of them are also women and children. Israeli ex-chief of staff just a couple of days ago in a speech in a kibbutz has said that they anticipate that at least the number of casualties is 200,000, and casualties here is both killed and injured. There have been research estimates that were surfacing that put the numbers at much higher, several 100,000 higher, and one of them has been circulating that quotes a number closer to 700,000. Even if we don't take any other than the reported numbers in the databases, which are named numbers, and named persons killed, there are still many people under the rubble that will only be possible to count later. Yet genocide is not calculated by numbers, it's calculated by a criteria that includes intent. Yet, as we have seen, many of the experts and of the witnesses on the ground and away have declared that the legal definition of genocide have been reached. That includes organizations like MSF, Amnesty International, the ICJ, already more than a year and a half ago, have declared the feasibility, the prejudice and risk of genocide on the Palestinian people in Gaza. But also the destruction in whole or in part of a population doesn't only include the direct killing of people, but the prevention of aid, the displacement, and the prevention of conditions of life, conditions that sustain life. Over the past months, since early March, there has been a near total blockade on humanitarian aid in Gaza, which led directly to a famine that was declared in Gaza City and risks the rest of the Strip. The displacement orders continue coming. The destruction, the near total destruction of Gaza City has been live streamed, including all buildings. And some of them, those displacement orders are coming just today, displacing population that is already actively in famine towards yet another supposedly safe area. In the meantime, many of the life-sustaining facilities, including healthcare, have been targeted multiple times. In the middle of that, one of the biggest failures we're seeing is not only the failure to act, but the direct complicity in the acts of genocide by Western liberal governments, the dismantling of international humanitarian law, and the cover-up, whether that is by the United States, the traditional ally of Israel, or by the United Kingdom, which put a red carpet to the president of Israel, who declared that no one is innocent in Gaza before. Institutions like Chatham House still gives a place for Herzog to speak to their public. And the European Union has repeatedly accepted the excuses of Israel, including by the President Ursula von der Leyen, who, according to many legal experts, speaks illegally about the position of the European Union which she doesn't represent, the foreign policy of the European Union. So the failure of governments leaves very little in the way of what can be done to stop an active genocide. The question we're asking today is, what can be done by others? And the others here are, in our question, are humanitarian actors, particularly large international humanitarian organizations. Those have had multiple positions, from classical neutrality, where nothing is said and you wouldn't know that there's a genocide if you read their websites, up to quite aggressive denunciations. Yet, denunciations are not enough at this stage. They aren't changing much. There is an effort underway, which is the flotilla, the Global Smooth Flotilla, which is trying to break the siege. And this flotilla has no formal humanitarian actors on board. The only one is an Italian search and rescue organization called Emergency. Otherwise, none of the big humanitarian actors has participated or attempted to break the siege. There is still a delusional conviction that shaking hands with the same people who are causing the mayhem might lead to some kind of access and delivery of effective humanitarian aid. The question I'm going to ask you, and I will start with Dr. Hamoudi. Dr. Shahid, what do you think are the available routes for humanitarian actors to influence the outcome? And here I'm not talking only about delivering aid, but about actually participating in ending the genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamam, for your generous introduction and for hosting this discussion today. First of all, as you have done, we must start with the recognition of the horror of the subject matter that we're speaking of. As we speak now, over 1 million people are undertaking displacement in Gaza. And as noted by them, displacement is as bad as famine. Children and families, many have lost limbs, and with the most horrendous situation are being forced to sleep on the streets, and with the numbers and estimates of how far this has gone. We also start with the recognition of the utter failure of the international community in handling this live-streamed genocide, and this should really come hand in hand with what can only be described as a very existential reckoning with the primary premises of how international organizations conduct themselves in relation to states. This discourse, as we know it, the humanitarian discourse, has over time been saturated with a fragmented reading of international law that really evades basic principles of self-determination and equality. The sad thing, as you kindly noted, is that many humanitarian organizations readily accepted narratives and readings of international law that deny the agency and the humanity of the Palestinian people in the name of neutrality or two-sidedness. And by that, they fed the they risked lending a settler colonial power the benefits of the vagueness of the law as well as a consistent presumption of good faith without starting with a very existential reckoning with what is this about. This is an active settler colonial premises to claim that there is a right to of self-defense which doesn't exist under positivist international law against an area that a state itself occupies, is to basically give a settler colonial power the capacity or the legal ammunition to justify a very dominating, very dominating military attack. And this is what we've seen. This is not a war among adversaries. This is an absolute act of domination and annihilation in all of its respect. Of course, this is September, and we have to also reckon with the fact that over 500,000 children haven't made it to school this year, yet again for the second year. So calling things by their name is absolutely very important to capture causality here. And in this stall, really, there must be a radical change of tactics in how we approach humanitarian work, and the presumption that everyone in this career is a person who wants to contribute towards the elevation of something that we call war and the ultimate destruction of it. We have to reshape how we understand the name of things as well as the causality and what happens. The main reason why the genocide is still ongoing is because of what we call the military technology complex that has given fuel to the far right. And what we do cannot be deemed as to be apolitical. It is speaking in the name of justice, really does require engaging with the core of what otherwise might deem a political question, especially if you are in the UK or in Denmark, where basic questions about adherence to international humanitarian law were repeatedly named as political. Over the course of this conversation, I hope to highlight some of the most important ongoing things at the moment. Of course, we are currently waiting for Algeria to push forward with a UN Security Council resolution on protective measures. I've seen the draft and it's as weak as it comes, and this is very much, it's a shameful moment for the government of Algeria, which was an important comrade in histories of liberation. However, nevertheless, of course, this resolution, regardless of what is in it, will fail since it's a Security Council, and we will be looking at a Uniting for Peace resolution at the General Assembly. We are not in New York. Palestinians are not in New York, including the Palestine mission itself, which is very, very weak. And I have to reiterate on and on again, and this must be very importantly laid out. The Palestinian state does not really represent the Palestinian people, and this is very important. Like any other post-colonial government, it's a decoy government that really is negotiating not in the name of self-determination, and it has blocked our diplomatic channels. So only with active support of our partners as well as of ally states are we able to do anything about this. Of course, adding to the fact that most of us are sanctioned and incapable of making it to the General Assembly, including most recently, of course, the sanctioning of the most prominent human rights organizations in Palestine, of course, who are also sanctioned from their homeland. As we look now in the General Assembly, we have multiple things going forward. Most importantly, and must be prioritized, third state responsibility, arms embargo, economic sanctions. No discussion can go forward without those. The whole of the international legal system is premised on that. How are we supposed to teach students international law going forward by saying that the main premises of it was evaded? And this is not a luxury, this is basic obligation. Secondly, of course, is the support of protective presence inside of Gaza, and this has been a disputed point among people. How far would this go? We are now looking at a form of protective presence that takes control, most importantly, of the borders, that delegitimizes the current schemes that are being put by the Trump regime as well as Gulf states inside of Gaza, and to take control of the primary control of distributing aid. This is a very dangerous thing if it doesn't come with the right caveats. And by that, I mean centering the Palestinian right of self-determination and Palestinian voices, meaningful participation in such mechanisms at its core, as well as transparency, due diligence that ensures that there's adherence to these principles at all juncture, given this very sad history of UN intervention in such contexts that usually is very far away from the needs of the local community. And that, of course, critique exists in abundance. So we are looking for as much as possible support with taking forward these priorities. I will shortly, if given the possibility, share a draft UNGA resolution that has been drafted by multiple Palestinian civil society actors, and we are hoping as much as possible to approach states with that and to gain as much support as possible to ensure that these are the things that are prioritized. Also, we are asking for an accountability mechanism that did make it through the Human Rights Council a few months ago, but sadly enough, the United States of America and the EU held the phone up to the Palestinian Authority, and that mechanism didn't make it. And that mechanism is already there. I'm happy to speak further about this momentum that we're building for in the next 2 weeks, and as well as, of course, I'll just quickly just finish the point. Supporting mutual aid on the ground. At the moment, the Palestinian organizations on the ground leading have proven themselves to be very much apt for that process, figuring out how that works and giving them the knowledge that we have on how we take things on the ground is very important. They're saving those who are most vulnerable and not getting any donations or money, supporting regional efforts, especially on the economic side, and switching our mode of advocacy to focus more on the economic side of things, like the EU gas deal, like what the corporations are currently doing, and supporting the leadership on that. We're really, really low. We're on our knees with the workforce that we have, and of course, generally supporting freedom of speech and people who are arrested. There are many more things that I'm happy to speak of. These are the main things that come to my mind, and I apologize for taking more than 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Shahad, for the quick, and you're right, there is plenty to talk about, and we will have hopefully that opportunity. I keep from it the calling things by their name and the causality, and those are things I want to come back to. The protective presence, the United for Peace, and nuancing what that means, and the resolution to the UN General Assembly that is being drafted, and what can be done about it by civil society actors. But I will move to Dr. Philip Proudfoot. Philip, thank you for joining us, and please take the.
Thank you. Yes, those were excellent remarks, and I wholeheartedly agree with everything that was just said. So let me try and repeat it in a different way and more from the perspective of international humanitarians rather than the legal perspective. So I agree with what's been said entirely so far, that the most important first step is that we have to be clear on what is happening in Gaza, and it is a genocide. Israel is committing the crime of all crimes. And as others have said, it's been live streamed now, not for 2 weeks, but for nearly 2 years. And the first step for humanitarians to stopping a genocide is that we have to cease pretending it's anything else, not just naming it, but stop calling it other things. It's not a humanitarian emergency, nor a tragic conflict, not a temporary crisis, and it's certainly not a complicated political situation. It is a genocide. And naming does matter. Naming matters because genocides are limit events, and they overwhelm our frameworks that we've come to rely on, be they legal, moral, and indeed humanitarian. And it's bringing into sharp focus an old dilemma of humanitarianism, where we feel we're tasked with treating symptoms and ignoring causes. But I think in Gaza, that contradiction is becoming fully existential. And if we continue to ignore the cause of Palestinian suffering, which is settler colonialism, the Israeli state, and the global North governments that arm, fund, and politically shield it, then the ethical tension is no longer just a sting of discomfort we feel, but it's risking, I believe, the collapse of the entire aid system. And history will not judge us kindly if we continue. And while I appreciate others have now shifted, but if we continue to hide behind the language of neutrality, while our people are being starved and bombed and erased by a state backed, crucially, by the very donors who fund the system, or used to fund the system, that we all work within and alongside. And this then has the next implication, I think, is that we need to stop, as humanitarians, outsourcing politics. We must abandon this assumed division of labor where humanitarians deliver aid and we wait for others to do the politics. The formal and technical versions of the humanitarian system that Tamam alluded to, that imagines aid as a kind of neutral bureaucratic activity conducted according to the procedures of international humanitarian law, has run its course. Like others, humanitarian actors, I think, once believed that they were operating in their own kind of end of history, where humanitarian space had been carved out and it was guaranteed. And while there were struggles, it was pretty much accepted. But the truth is that we're seeing now that it wasn't accepted, it isn't accepted, and that era is over. The rise of impunity and illiberalism is exposing the limits of a humanitarian system that has forgotten how to challenge power and, crucially, how to build a movement to confront it. But if we look to our past, we actually can find and locate, as I'm sure we'll do throughout the talk, courageous moments in humanitarian history, acts of defiance, the breaking of sieges, the confronting of blockades, and the challenging of governments. So I think the other thing we must do then is look to that past and reclaim a public humanitarian space such that it was never a gift from powerful states, but it was carved out by people, activists, and publics who refused to look away from suffering. And that public still exists, but that public is now on the streets protesting, on university campuses, and in meeting halls. And right now, as we speak, it is aboard the Samud flotilla floating towards Gaza. And what this means is I also think we need to stop talking about donors as if they are these abstractions. Donors are actually governments. And in the global north, those governments have publics. And if we took action, if we joined the flotilla, those publics who are opposed to genocide would be appalled if those governments then sought to restrict, restrain, or punish the humanitarian actors, because those publics, the global majority, would be on our side. And the final point is I think we need to reckon with ourselves. So humanitarianism is often presented as something that reduces affected populations to a kind of bare life, bodies that are kept alive, stripped of their history, politics, and agency. And while much of that critique is true, I think Gaza has also revealed something about ourselves, and that we were risking dehumanizing ourselves when we tell ourselves that we cannot act, and we say that our role is only to deliver or at best to witness, and not intervene, and not to resist, and not to take sides. I think we're not just producing a moral discomfort. For many, I think we're experiencing a moral injury that is breaking something within us as humanitarians. And I think that's why the flotilla hangs over and haunts this conversation, because the flotilla reveals what is possible. It shows that there is a humanitarianism that can be rooted not in technical silences, but in courage, in solidarity, and a refusal to accept a world in which a genocide is permitted to take place. So then, what should humanitarians do to stop the genocide? I believe we must name it, confront it, we should break the siege, and we should join the flotilla, and we should then reframe humanitarianism as a moral and political force that is aligned with the causes of justice, resistance, and life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. And I will come back from that again to the issue of naming, because I think that is the entry point to some of the more potent discussions that have been either agreed with or denied over the past months by humanitarian organizations, but also to the flotilla as a humanitarian or not activity in the coming in the coming discussion. But before that, I will go to Freddie Carver. Freddie, thank you for taking the floor.
Thank you very much, Tamam. Thank you for the opportunity today, and thanks to the other speakers as well. I think they've both laid out incredibly powerfully, I think, the challenges that are faced in the response to this situation. And I'm not going to try to repeat what they've said, but I guess what I want to say is from the perspective of maybe humanitarian organizations, I think, try to unpack a bit, I think, how the kind of dilemmas that people are trying to work their way through, and what that means for the decisions that they need to make. We actually had a conversation last week, and I think one of the things that we've been talking about is the need to get out of our silos, which I think very much links to some of what's been said before. This isn't a time for humanitarians to talk to each other about the situation in Gaza. We need to look at this in a very comprehensive way. We need to look at it from a political perspective. We need to look at it from a legal perspective. So we need to be talking to human rights agencies. We need to be talking to activist groups. And most importantly, we need to be speaking to Palestinians wherever we can. And I think one of the things that hung over that conversation is, what does humanitarian space even look like in this context? And I think that goes to something you said, Philip. And for those agencies that are delivering any form of assistance right now on the ground, to what extent are they able to do that in line with humanitarian principles? And I think we all know that humanitarian principles are not some kind of thing that are kind of written on stone, that we have neat definitions of that we can just stand by. They are constant sets of compromises and discussions. And I think the reality from speaking to people who are operating in Gaza right now is that the compromises are enormous. One of the most kind of things that was reiterated last week was we are doing things today that we wouldn't have been doing 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have dreamed of doing 10 years ago in terms of the ways we're working, the compromises we're making. And I think there are the extremity of the challenge, as you were saying, Philip, for organizations that are part of, let's say, the traditional humanitarian system, funded by the traditional humanitarian donors, in the context of a genocide that is perceived as an extension of Western international policy. That is a very extreme position to be in. And we've faced versions of this in many different contexts over the years. But I do think that the particular setting right now in Gaza brings it to a point which is beyond what humanitarians have had to face in the last few years, certainly situations that I've come across in my own career. And I think the question that hung over the discussion we had last week is, should we even be there at all? To what extent are we legitimizing? To what extent are the compromises we make part of the policy of the government? If we're having to make these compromises, are we able to do enough in terms of witnessing, in terms of retaining proximity to communities, in terms of actually kind of listening to and then sharing the perspectives of people on the ground? And I think for me, there isn't a single answer to that. I mean, and maybe that's something we'll talk about. Whether the idea of walking away is always so challenging in a humanitarian context. But I think the bar for what humanitarians should be expected to do, to deliver on things like principles of humanity in this context, needs to be extremely high. Are we doing everything we can to represent the views of Palestinians? Are we really able to get access in a way that is meaningful? Are we really able to save lives in a way that isn't putting lives at risk? I think these are the kinds of questions that people need to be asking themselves. And is it even feasible to act in a way that is in line with humanitarian principles if we're going to be part of a formal system and accept funding from countries that are part of this problem? And I think these are the questions that people need to be challenging themselves on, and then thinking very hard about what their options are. I think some of the points you made as well, Philip, about I think back of other examples over the years when agencies have had to go across borders where they didn't have permission, where they didn't have legitimacy. Now that's extremely difficult, if not impossible, in a securitized context like the one we're dealing with in Gaza. But going to the point that you made, Dr. Shad, about mutual aid groups, we do now, in the 21st century, have options. We do have ways of operating that allow us to bypass some of the systems and the processes. And I think we really need to be very creative and push the envelope as far as we can in a context like this, again, to meet that bar. And I think that for me is the key question, is and also thinking then about what the space is for advocacy, for leveraging political influence to the extent that humanitarian agencies have it in their domestic constituencies. And I don't think that's an easy question right now, given the kind of nature of kind of global debate. I think there are definitely opportunities, but I don't think it's easy necessarily to see how humanitarian agencies can leverage political influence. But I firmly agree that these are the kind of challenges that everyone needs to be asking themselves, given the depth of the situation. Thanks.
Thank you. And I take the point, Freddie, on the assistance on the ground, the compromises, and what can be done in it, because we have to acknowledge here that one of the arguments that is made by humanitarian actors in any position they are is that their primary function is delivery of aid and services to people affected, and that this trumps any other function, and that there are human rights organizations and others who would do the witnessing, documenting, and speaking out. However, it is difficult to accept that, given that the very limited access and the denial of Palestinian voice. There are plenty of Palestinians who have been talking about what's happening, witnessing it. I mean, those who haven't been killed as in journalists and humanitarian workers in Palestine targeted intentionally and eliminated more journalists in more Palestinian journalists have been killed than most wars combined, if I remember the numbers right. But I want to start with a question that came that addresses an issue with what Shahad and Philip said, the naming issue. And I want to recycle an argument that I've heard many, many times so far. Why should we speak out? Why should we call it a genocide? What difference does it make? And I've heard that from people who are hiding behind it and from people who are very concerned about it. And the argument is, if we call it genocide, at least in the early days, we lose access. That turns out to be really not very true, because organizations that have called it genocide haven't lost access in a way that is more significant than those who haven't. Two others who refuse to mention not only genocide, there are organizations that have statements over the past 2 years that do not name Israel. And if you read them without knowing the context, you wouldn't know what they're talking about. There is a retreat into this, like the most abstract and ambiguous form of neutrality in the name of retaining access, retaining relationships, and so on. Now, I don't think we have enough hours to speak about the false pretense of neutrality when we call, the 1,500 people who were kidnapped in Tulkarm yesterday prisoners, and we call the Israeli hostages hostages. We've lost neutrality at the first layer before we even start talking about positions. Shaking hands with Kogat head, who is supposedly coordinating the humanitarian efforts from the Israeli army, who called Palestinian human animals and should be dealt with as such, and was quoted in the ICJ. So let me ask you, why is it important to name genocide? And here, I'm not talking about the past weeks. I sat in organizations where people have forcefully demanded that this be named genocide in November 2023. It was obvious to many that this is not just another conflict. We didn't discover it to be a genocide just a month ago. So I'll start with Shahad and then Philip, and I'll ask you, why is it important? What did we lose by those who used ambiguous and opaque language?
Thank you for that, Tamam. So to start with, the reality here is that this is really a continuation of colonial erasure. And I myself spoke to the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights on the 23rd of October to lay down the case for a genocide. And the answer that I got from Turk was, what is your plan for the day after? And disregarding everything that was just said. Whether he likes it or not, his statement is inherently one that undervalues my own humanity and carries forward very, very dangerous presumptions. I agree that there must be a degree of pragmatism, and us Palestinians know pragmatism very well, and we've had to negotiate with this system that was inherently not built in our favor for generations. But there is a very clear point when it stops being a pragmatic position and it ends up being a complicit position. And that becomes really clear when you look into the future, whether we like it or not, whether it's happening now or in 10 years, at some point there will be a global awakening to comprehend what is really happening in the ground. When one person is equipped with the knowledge that this is one, a settler colonial context where 80% of the people in Gaza are actually refugees from what we now call Israel, and these people have lived under a siege for 17 years, and this is a very racist, like the state of Israel within its law is an apartheid state, and that has been proven by every single possible document within the human rights system to get it to say that we did it. We have all the paperwork to tell you that this is it. Just look at the Jewish national law that says that this is racial superiority. So we are considered a second race. So the fact is, when is it that you stop the argument for pragmatism? and realize that by engaging with that actor, or by not unifying your voices, your perception with the people on the ground or the oppressed people, you do cross the threshold of complicity, is when you figure out that in the future, when this is all over, you will look at yourself with shame, and you will know that you've stood right next to the dark side of history. And the reality is there will be, and there are people I will never forgive. And there are organizations, I'm sure, are listening here today, who I really look at the moment when they reckon with the reality with horror, because it wasn't enough that 200,000 people were killed, or the amputations or whatnot. So as for the access presumption, I would tell you, you'd presume that if you have a good faith rational actor that you're engaging with, not a far right wing government that on the first day of the genocide said that we want to annihilate them and invoked Amalek. We kill them with their sheep, with their women, with their children, and annihilate them. And to still presume good faith after that, I would say that that is either a conscious or a subconscious form of denying humanity. Because in reality, if the humanitarian field had power, that power would only come through the unification of voices, as well as the centering of the voices of those who are oppressed. As people who work in the humanitarian sector, a very clear compass, rather of these abstract humanitarian principles, a very clear perspective that really centers those who are stuck in what Jill Stauffer calls ethical loneliness, and that is the position of being like completely surrounded by structural inequality, and not having the capacity to voice your own stuff. That's what I believe that people in the humanitarian field have entered to do. But to end up really risking that, you're justifying that premises. So what I'm saying is, it's very muddy waters, and it's this point where only a clear moral compass is there. And the only way, also, I have to really strongly say this, the only way you could say that this is not a genocide is by disrespecting the whole history of colonization and saying that I haven't read that, and I look at that history with disdain, and all of the millions of people who died in the struggle for ending colonization, to disrespect their lives and their history. And that, with all due respect, is a very Eurocentric position. And not only that, it's one conversation with one person in Gaza is enough to invoke the things that we only thought exist in epics. So for those who still are afraid to say the G word, not only there's the G word, what is an illegal occupation but alien domination and subjugation, aka colonialism? So you're basically denying both history and ongoing reality, shaking hands in something, shaking hands with a very bad faith colonial actor. And not only that, history will judge you very, very, very harshly. And your whole discipline, which is as we know it today, is it's as UN rapporteurs said months ago, almost a year ago, the whole of the international legal system is at a knife's edge. So are you willing to play that game, or would you want to be on the right side of history? I know that's not the most practical answer, but it's the first one that really comes to mind, and it's still very, very, very shocking. Whoever still cannot see that an army of over 20,000 amputated children with amputated limbs is not a sign of a regime that wants to ethnically cleanse people or have read history. It's a shame. You don't see me as a human being, I guess. But yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Shad. Philip, before I come to you, in the New Humanitarian, last December, we have published an editorial saying it is complicit to not name what is happening. And that many didn't. There were the development afterwards. Last July, I've written an argument saying denunciation is not enough. And you need to drag your governments to the courts, to national courts, to European Court of Human Rights, and to the ICJ by humanitarian actors. And you need to be on the flotilla and break the siege. Let's start with the naming and then progress to, and obviously that call didn't go anywhere because there aren't humanitarian organizations on the flotilla, although I hear they discussed it, but thank God they did. Let's hear what you think about the naming particularly, and anything else.
So the point around naming, I think, from the perspective of of humanitarians, it returns to what I said in my opening remarks around this being a limit event. When we call something a genocide, it's not the same as a kind of, a conflict we might be working within. It is a genocide. Therefore, a lot of the expectations and frameworks that we have and we operate within no longer seem to apply, right? So we need to, that's what it provokes us and forces us to think about what would be the ethically correct course of humanitarian action in that context. And the second reason, and you mentioned, the initial hesitancy, those of us who've worked on Palestine for a long time and in the Middle East for a long time, we know that the Israeli state relies on ambiguity. It will issue an initial denial very strongly, even though it's so clear something has happened. It will deny that it attacked the hospital, outright deny it, and then the media will run it, and then eventually there might be an admission somewhere buried in a long time. But by that point, everyone thinks that the Israeli story is true. When you're dealing with a belligerent that relies on ambiguity, it is our responsibility to be very crystal clear in the language that we use. And that brings me to the third point as to why we should call it a genocide. And this is what Shahid said, is that we should call it a genocide because the Israelis tell us they are committing genocide. They have said that they are committing genocide almost from the beginning in November. Intent has never been clearer. The amount of evidence for intent, on the Accountability Archive, we have collected 89,000 statements. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them are examples of senior Israeli figures issuing intent, right? And this brings me to the fourth point. And you were also saying this time, one of the other reasons why it's important to call it a genocide and for it to increasingly be recognized as a genocide is that we can see that international law has been burned to the ground, but there is this possibility for domestic law. So the Genocide Act is written into British law. The moment that we have a definitive understanding and ruling that a genocide has been carried out, then we can initiate domestic legal proceedings against British politicians who have aided and facilitated the genocide, up to and including the continued use of surveillance flights from Cyprus over Gaza, where now there's evidence that those flights were not carried out in the areas that the Israelis even said there were apparently hostages, but in areas where there was active fighting. And it's for the British government and others to then answer, how were they not aiding and assisting in genocide? And then the final reason why it's important to call it a genocide is that the international system that we work within, and this is what me and Martin Griffiths recently argued on an IDS piece, is that if we say it is a genocide, then there are a series of steps that are supposed to happen, namely the responsibility to protect doctrine. This is not even talked about. Yes, there's one mechanism through Uniting for Peace, but this is taking responsibility to protect into different hands. This is actually supposed to be a Security Council obligation. So this, we know what is supposed to happen when there's a genocide. The first stage is supposed to be strong condemnations. We've had that. Then it's supposed to be sanctions against the state. We haven't had that. We've had some sanctions against a few Israeli politicians from the British, but mostly in the West Bank, in order to avoid claims of their own complicity within genocide, so they focus on the West Bank. And then after that, it's supposed to rise up to and include the possibility of the commission of an international military force to dismantle and stop the genocide. That's what's supposed to happen. But by trying to stop us before we even say genocide, we can't even get onto that path. In fact, it's not that we're not even on that path. It's that members of the Security Council are arming and assisting the side that's carrying out the genocide. So this is why that word is so important. And I disagree with this idea of, oh, it's just a word, it's just a description. No, it is a word that carries consequences that are supposed to be kicked into motion. That's why we have to insist on it.
Thank you, Philip. And I take the point, and I want to go back to what Freddie mentioned about the humanitarian system, because another counter argument to is, and I've been told that myself, is why did you just forget Sudan and the Rohingya crisis and all the other things, and why do you only care about Gaza? Well, I mean, there is a reason this is the crime of all crimes, but there's also another dimension. What happens in Gaza is going to draw out what everybody else consider the limits of the permissible when it comes to international humanitarian law. What was a hesitant, as Philip mentioned before, deny bombing the hospital, deny, This has happened before. It happened in Syria when the Russian forces bombed civilian facilities, and the Syrian regime, the old Syrian regime, bombed, and the denial was absolute. And by the time anything is proven, the rhetoric has stuck, and there's nothing to do about it. The same is happening. It is becoming normalized. And I want to quote, I mean, we've just put out today an investigation that shows the systematic nature of targeting aid seekers. Now aid has become, again, nothing entirely new. It's just so systematic and normalized and uncondemned and done with such an impunity that I struggle to see why any other belligerent in the future would actually hesitate. And why would any of the current, Western donors, however you want to call them, dare speak against anyone else who uses aid as a weapon of war or famine as a weapon of war or so on? So, Freddie, are we seeing the falling apart of the humanitarian system through the politics of impunity for Israel and through the complacency of the humanitarian system itself?
Thanks, Tamam. Yeah, I think you put it really well. And I think the fact that what is happening in Gaza is happening at the same time as the kind of the funding crisis that the humanitarian system has seen over the last 12, 18, 24 months, depending on how we want to look at it, which is kind of directly and explicitly linked to decisions, political decisions being made by the traditional donors to the humanitarian system. I mean, I'm not saying they're direct. Well, these decisions are not unlinked, and I think they speak to a wider set of questions that I know everyone within the system has been struggling with. The challenges that I think all organizations know is that at a time when you're unclear of your ability to survive, of your ability to employ people, of the future of your kind of family, your colleagues' livelihoods, it becomes increasingly challenging to kind of step back and think about some of these wider questions. But there are many people who are, and I think we absolutely have to. And I think it raises a set of questions about what is the humanitarian endeavor right now? What is the humanitarian initiative? And to what extent is it a delivery vehicle for goods and services, patching up the worst excesses of the 21st century world? There's a version of the humanitarian system that is that. And I think if that's where you are, then that has a set of implications for how you behave. But I think most of us, most people who are kind of part of the humanitarian endeavor, will continue to call it for reasons of vocation, feel that there's something more, feel that there's something in there around solidarity, around being present, around a kind of a embodiment of human compassion. And if that is the motivating force behind humanitarianism, then I think this is definitely a moment to reflect on whether we're living up to it. I think it's really important not to be naive. Like, we do not live in a world where that's possible and where we can just say, well, we just need to try and do the good thing. We all know that where good intentions lead. But I think we do need to reflect on how do those notions of solidarity tie in with notions of justice, and what does that mean for how humanitarians behave? I think one point I wanted to pick up on that you raised, I think it's notable that for some humanitarian actors, it's been easier to speak out on Gaza. Maybe not as strongly as we might like to have seen, but then in comparison with Sudan or comparison with Myanmar. And I think that that's also something we need to reflect on. What is it? Why is it that the kind of particular politics make it easier to be more vocal? Whereas on things that are less in the public eye, actually, I think I don't include the new humanitarian within this, but we allow these things to completely drop out of the mindset where we're facing the same challenges. I was living in Ethiopia during the Tigray War. And I think that the way that the humanitarian sector collectively conducted itself also wasn't great in terms of presenting real solidarity with the people facing severe attacks. So I agree with you. I think these questions are really present right now. I think they're a challenge for donor governments. They're a challenge for the UN. I see some questions around the UN in the chat. And I think it's a really difficult and complicated moment for the UN to work out how it lives up. What the UN should be bringing to the table in this context is the fact that it is an equal membership of 193 states. And is it in practice able to kind of operate in a way that reflects that and find middle space? I think for NGOs, it asks a different set of questions. So I think that the key point is that everyone right now needs to be asking themselves a set of questions around politically, how do we position ourselves? What's our strategy? What is our contribution to the future that we see our role as? Where do we have leverage? Do we have leverage anywhere? Is it with publics? Is it with governments? Is it but if you don't have a clear political strategy, then the chances of being instrumentalized and used are extremely high.
Thank you, Freddie. Before we move to questions from the audience and to what can be done actually in more practical terms, there's a question about accountability. And I mean, the accountability, the negligence or lack of fear of accountability is mind-boggling. Whether that is in politicians, like Keir Starmer putting a red carpet for the president of a genocidal state, or, I mean, I'm not surprised, the former foreign minister of Germany who justified the genocide is now the president of the UN General Assembly. There's no, however, we are going to get, as Shahad mentioned, you know, what will happen in the future? We will get all those books about the tear-jerking books about how those who remember Romeo Dallaire, the head of the UN peacekeeping force, who wrote a book about shaking hands with the devil after he followed order or not, and left the genocide to continue in Rwanda. There will be those. And there will be accountability. There is, and I keep mentioning that maybe because we don't have many other examples as well documented. I don't think it's particularly the ICRC in difference to anyone else, although they have been silent. But Jean-Claude Favet talked about their role in the Holocaust and said the failure to put their full weight and take the ultimate risk in protecting people was the unjustifiable part. And I would argue that today, in an environment where whether an organization is denouncing or not, they are not putting their full weight and taking the ultimate risk. Part of it, as Freddie mentioned, I mean, the choice under the current economic circumstances in the humanitarian sector is if you piss enough donors, you close up, you fire your people and go home. And the argument is always, whether that is self-interested or not, it's better for us to continue doing stuff than to disappear. And people will have to come to terms with this in the future. But what is difficult to swallow is humanitarian organizations, whether UN, others. We've seen Cindy McCain go and shake hands with Netanyahu a few days ago and accept a joint statement issued by his office about his utter surprise that there are hungry people in Gaza and how they agreed together that they will do everything they can. The ability to sit through this and be silent or be complicit or be complacent is mind-boggling. And we are told that, trust us, we are doing negotiations behind closed doors. We are the one, you know, you don't know what we're doing, but we're doing it. Yet there isn't any other institution in the world that we would trust, including our own governments, that we would trust with that without accountability. They are spending public money. And we are told, just trust us, we're negotiating we're doing the good job, but just behind closed doors. And these theatrics we have to do. How can we function without transparency? What is the alternative? And if this is not how humanitarianism should look like under the conditions of genocide, should it look like the flotilla that is being disowned and looked down at by formal humanitarian organizations as this is, amateur political activism that we shouldn't take seriously? But those are people who are on boats, and I have boarded one of the boats for part of the way, the legal observer boat, and talked to people on the flotilla, on the Smooth flotilla, directly. Those are people that know they might be killed as a result. If this is not humanitarianism, it's hard to consider. And I take it, Freddie, this is the part about the moral. The problem is, we want, as a humanitarian system, to be considered a delivery mechanism. Let us deliver when it suits us. But we want to carry the moral argument, occupy the whole moral space, and leave no part of it for activism, for other kinds of political engagement, and so on. So I'll go back to Shahad and ask, what transparency and what accountability should we demand of the humanitarian system who have a serious risk of being complicit in this genocide?
A big question, Tamam, a very big one. First of all, we're close to a moment of reckoning globally. It's already happening, and it's happening among the young more than the old, and people who we can call the majority of the world, who could see the reality, are disgusted by the reality, and are quite angry of it. Whether we like it or not, at some point there will be an accountability mechanism here to speak of. And I just want to note that, personally, I wasn't this surprised, because if you study the history of IHL, you find that Henry Dunant himself was a colonialist going on his way to Algeria to solicit his business via Napoleon. So the fact that the system always tolerated the dehumanization of colonized people is the system working by itself. The same story happened for the Kenyans, the Algerians, as well as the Angolans. Everyone who tried to use IHL in the context of colonization was specifically faced with so much pressure. With completely being ignored. So the question now of how is it that we will see accountability towards them? Prior to this accountability, a reckoning has to happen. And I would argue that the case of Palestine, and you pose this question, what makes it so special? It's a very case of extremity that sheds power relations bare, but also two, it's a classic case of colonization in the age of neo-colonization. By that I mean it's a classic case of the use of physical coercion, as in it's the classic tactics of it's not that you want to use your liberal trade or investment to ensure that these people cannot establish their self-determination. You use direct force of ethical cleansing. And the reality is the fascistic line that Israel is live streaming to the whole world has a very short lifeline according to the history, because how long can you uphold this system? How long can you do this? And the Palestinians, even if they're all killed, if there's just one, they will still keep on saying, no, we want our dignity, we want our land, and it's our duty to our ancestors. So first of all, there has to be reckoning with that reality that I just described among a huge amount of people, including those with the leverage. You asked what is the leverage of people in the humanitarian sector. The world listens to them as a moral compass, and their strong unified position does matter. And it's very sad that NGOs would rather have played pragmatism rather in the donor dilemma, rather than actually establish what they were made for. And risking being used as humanitarian camouflage and toleration of medical lawfare and the whole thing. Really, Al-Ma'madani massacre in late 2023 is when all the people in Gaza say that humanity was killed. Like, that's when we have the bar set so low. So the accountability for those big international organizations, I think, ought to start with one, people in the same field hosting what we would call a form of people's tribunals in order to conceptualize and articulate what this form of complicity means. We still don't have the words to describe it really, because the whole system is made in a way where we're not able to describe it. How is it that a humanitarian organization is found to have facilitated indirectly a genocide or tolerated the genocide? But I think developing the vocabulary is already happening, and it's coming really close because the critical scholars are being pushed to the forefront, and now we will have that. So I think they will not only, so there will be people's tribunals, there will be reckoning with that, as was the case with South Africa, as was the case of anyone who shaked hands with colonization. But also, I think this is so big and so bad that going to the future, we will need to ask ourselves, everyone will have to ask, and your children, all of our children, what did you do to stop this? And when the answer is, I negotiated and bought colonization more time, which is what bad use of humanitarian mechanisms, as Freddie noted, you risk being used as a mechanism that would, a humanitarian camouflage, you buy them time. And justice delayed is justice denied. And that form of passive, let's say, acceptance of atrocity and its basic contradiction will mean killing your whole basic primary premises as an organization. I don't think anyone can survive that contradiction going forward. And our job is to ensure that the public, as well as the people within the industry, have the language and the capacity to challenge that and demonstrate that contradiction, so that the next generation will not have to live through this. They will not have to handle something as complicated as such hidden hypocrisy and facilitation of this, let's say, tolerance. And the saddest thing is, I've also engaged with organizations that were like, it's not a genocide until a court says it is. And this, I say, is there's a clear test on when law is being used as a tool of power, and it is when it's used to completely deny reality. So by telling me that I should wait for the International Court of Justice, who just accepted that Israel submits its written statements, I think still few more months into the future, January 2026, is a completely, please, can you 100,000 more people and we will maybe start to think about it. Is that something that you'd be willing to look at yourself in the mirror and live through? I hope that somehow, but yeah, just to flash also, we're currently putting forward accountability mechanisms, just like the public tribunals that were held at the United Nations in South Africa. So those seek to encapsulate not just direct forms of complicity and causality, but indirect forms. And these are things that I believe will gain momentum in whatever form or shape the international legal system will be after this ends, which I believe will be very different than what we have today.
Thank you. Philip, before I come to you, I've heard from people that I trust telling me that I'm doing harm by calling out the humanitarian sector. They're not the worst actors there is. And that why don't you call states? Why don't you call out, Well, there's an obvious reason. We are a news outlet that is concerned with the humanitarian system and humanitarianism. But personally, it hurts because I have worked and believed in the humanitarian system all my career. I'm a product of it. And I call it out because I still have faith in the humanitarian system. I don't have faith in states at any level. And that's being proven every day. But I still have a faith that the humanitarian sector would do something good. And that as much as the harm of the hesitance and complacency, there is still a hope. And this is what we're asking today. So I want to ask a couple of questions from the audiences, and we have plenty of those. Professor Michael Barnett asks, are there other cases where humanitarians have been able to move the needle in similar circumstances? Bosnia, Rwanda, South Sudan, and Sudan, Rohingya. And greetings to Professor Barnett. He's one of the teachers on the history of humanitarianism. And one of the obvious things is MSF asked for a military intervention during the war in Rwanda. And this is documented meticulously in the Speaking Out case study that MSF put out, and all the trials and tribulations of them asking for a military intervention. Didn't work out well. it backfired quite significantly, actually, and caused a lot of, but it has happened. And I will ask now whether there is and would be a way to move the needle. And here I mean actually deter the genocide, stop it, or make a difference in the cost it is. It's the cost to both the Israel or to countries that are supporting it directly or indirectly. Philip, you mentioned R2P and United for Peace, and if you can give a glimpse of what do we mean by that, so our audience are with us on the same page.
So if I can briefly, just on the question of moving the dial as well, I think that as Freddie was describing this distinction between the kind of delivery mechanism of humanitarianism and the moral mission of humanitarianism, and this is kind of responding to Michael Barnett as well. Of course, I'm a great admirer of his work, but he probably knows everything I'm about to say. But the humanitarian, they actually work in together, right? So that before the invention of this thing that we call the humanitarian system, we didn't necessarily think, for example, that we ought to care about the suffering of others. So there was a kind of moral campaign. A Memory of Solferino is a campaigning pamphlet that establishes the idea that people shouldn't just die and suffer on a battlefield because they're part of the enemy forces, right? And then through that moral and campaigning mode, the idea of a humanitarianism as a delivery mechanism came into being. Now, what's different about Gaza is the assumptions that that delivery mechanism would be just simply permitted have collapsed. Because you cannot declare, there's no example I can think of where a famine is declared and literally nothing happens. And not just the use of the F word as a kind of activist, oh, I'm just saying the F word, I'm saying famine all the time to get, no, this was an IPC declaration of famine and no substantial pressure or relief came afterwards. And that is shocking. And I know that many across the sector feel absolute shock that it was that has not led to any shift. Now, the question of what can we do? I think that, as I said earlier, that a genocide is a limit event, and that means that we should say things that people might think, oh my God, that sounds ridiculous, that can't happen. But this is a limit event, the crime of all crimes. We should be doing everything we possibly can. So, for example, the flotilla would look very different if a large section of international organizations had also sent ships, because the first critique against the flotilla is that it is a selfie boat carrying an insignificant amount of aid. Now, those who make the critique do not understand humanitarian history. Save the Children sent relatively insignificant amounts of aid into Germany in 1919 to break the Allied siege, and by all accounts, the bottle tops that they sent for milk bottles were not actually that well used by German mothers, but nonetheless it was done as a campaigning activity to draw attention to the siege. And then when Jeb held a public meeting, she was pelted with rotten fruit, seen to be assisting the enemy, and then eventually a public was built up around the humanitarian mission. Now, all that stuff that was built by our humanitarian ancestors is now collapsing. Therefore, we have to look to the actions of those ancestors to figure out how can we rebuild the space where those who envision humanitarianism as simply delivery can actually deliver, because they can't deliver in Gaza. And responding to that by taking boats with not an insignificant amount of aid, but a vast amount of aid would probably do it. There are even bolder things that I think we should be discussing, for this is a genocide. So, for example, why is the emergency relief coordinator not leading truck after truck after truck to the border of Gaza, and then when he's turned around, he goes back the next day and the next day and the next day until they're let in? Why? Because the donor states will then, throw a fit? Of course they will. But then that is my point that I made, that donors are governments. They are not just these abstract entities, they also have publics. So if humanitarian organizations joined the flotilla, knowing that the vast majority of people are opposed to the genocide, and then governments then attempted to discipline their organizations for trying to get food to a starving population, those governments would face significant degrees of critique and are not isolated from their own accountability mechanisms, which is voting and elections. So there's the idea that we are completely powerless, or that if aid organizations joined the flotilla, that this would somehow weaken the credibility of the mission. The credibility, the technical part of the mission is gone, or it's going, and we have to be bolder, much bolder now. And we should consider these possibilities in this limit event. So that's my position, and I think that humanitarians are always moving the needle. The problem now is that the needle is way over here, and we're here, and we need to get back to the needle.
Thank you, Philip. Freddie, there are a couple of questions I want to combine and come to you. One of them is from Caroline Dober, and she says she'd be interested in hearing a view on the possible reason behind silence and paralysis of many humanitarian actors. Is it systemic? Is it leadership? What is it? And another one is by Senka Filipovich, and she says, I have witnessed NGO staff pushing their leadership to speak out to stop legitimizing genocidal actors, yet that leadership retaliates and creates a culture of fear. What advice do you have? And you know, how do you agree with that? Is it a problem of leadership, a problem of systematic, degradation into like hierarchical, authoritarian organizations? What is it that is preventing people from doing something more? Is it short-sightedness? It really is puzzling.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's very easy on this to be cynical. It's very easy to say everyone is, and I think maybe it's too unfair actually it's easy to paint this in a very negative light. But this is a reality for everyone, that they have to focus on their people, the people around them, their organizations. And we have to sort of put in the context of this a reality that organizations, particularly large organizations, are concerned about their future. And so they're concerned about taking risk. It puts people into a situation where they're very cautious. I mean, I think then we get into a whole range of individual kind of contexts, and everyone has their own backgrounds, their own perspectives, their own political positions. I can't possibly speak for everyone. There may be people who have very different political perspectives on this, but I would be seriously concerned if I was working for an organization right now where there wasn't even a willingness to have this debate and to have this discussion in an open and transparent manner, and that discussion wasn't informed by those people who are closest to the situation. And I think if that culture isn't there in organizations right now, that says something really problematic and really worrying. And I was thinking about this question you posed listening to Dr. Shad about accountability, and on a much more kind of parochial way. I mean, I've spent a lot of my time in the sector thinking about this accountability question. And I think there are so many, there's not a magic bullet on accountability, but there are so many creative things we could be doing to increase the accountability that organizations have for their work. Why can't organizations set up independent panels? Even to have discussions behind closed doors. I can understand that doing that in public might be extremely challenging, although I think you could make a case that there are circumstances under which you could present your work, talk about what you're doing, be honest about the decisions you're making. And allow that to be challenged. I talked earlier about, I think, the reality of the situation meaning that the bar needs to be really, really high. If you're going to continue, if you're going to kind of push yourself into this space and say that it is worth it, given all the risks that I think Palestinian activists and advocates are most kind of vehemently and powerfully expressing, then you have to have a very high bar, and that involves putting these kind of decisions in front of the people and saying, this is the decisions we're making. Can we justify them? Tell us why we can't. Help us to think about how we could make them differently. So I think the kind of failure of leadership to engage and to be so silent, I think is really problematic. And is definitely something that needs to be addressed. Do you mind? I wanted to pick up on another question that has been posed to me in the chat, if that's okay. And I really like it from Greg Hansen, asking about the evidence around expanding humanitarian space. And I think it obviously speaks to the work we do at HBG, and is something I will take away. And actually, we've been discussing a bit recently, maybe not quite framed this way, but I really like this framing. I mean, I think there is obviously a lot of evidence out there I don't think it speaks to vast successes, I have to say. Certainly not on a macro scale. I think, and it's evolved with the way that the kind of politics of humanitarianism has evolved. I think back to the setting where I kind of started out my humanitarian career in the kind of Sudan context. I came into the sort of very end of Operation Lifeline Sudan. That's a very kind of particular example of an attempt by the international system, led by the UN, led by governments, to create and expand humanitarian space in a very difficult context. And the reams of text on whether that was a good or a bad thing ultimately for the people of South Sudan and Sudan is a very complicated story. But I think the reason I raise it is because it's an interesting example of the level of ambition that we once might have had. And I think how much our ambition has dropped over the years. So I do think it's important to hold those things in our mind. When I think right now, where the better examples are, I think it tends to be around how it goes back to what I said earlier. How do we get around? How do we work in different ways? How do we expand humanitarian space through claiming space that states don't control? That seems to me to be pretty fundamental. And that gets us into murky waters, as I think was said earlier. These are, again, uncomfortable spaces for humanitarian access to operate in. But I think we have to kind of push and see how courageous we can be. And I think and again, this has come out in some of the chat comments that I've seen, there is that we need to kind of try to shed that corporate kind of professionalization, which has put everything into quite strict controls. And again, I know it's easy to say and much harder to do if you're a financial controller of a large organization, worrying about your audits. I'm not saying it's easy, but I do think, again, that the kind of the situations that we're the situation that we're dealing with here forces us to ask some really hard questions about some of this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Freddie. We have about 13 minutes before we finish, and I want to list a couple of things that came in the questions and then give you a chance to, say however you would like to close, and with focus on what should be done practically. What are we asking the humanitarian system to consider? There is a question that comes on. One of the arguments is if we speak out or do something, we put our Palestinian staff at risk of retaliation. Now, just to be clear, the Israeli authorities have issued the new rules on humanitarian aid, and they demand that NGOs supply them with the names of their Palestinian staff, which would be, it would be unwise given how they would expose their staff to retaliation. My understanding, other than GHF and Samaritan Purse, no one has done that, and hopefully no one will, because that would. But that brings us to people on the ground. Shad, you talked about that, and I've been exposed to this whole idea of we justify almost everything by saying, I've talked to our Palestinian colleagues. I mean, no one would ever, and this, I want to say this out of just noting it. I can't say I've spoken, I can't talk to Philip and then say I've spoken to, our British colleagues and this is the British opinion. But we find it bloody easy to say, having gone there and then having talked to someone in the West Bank and say, our Palestinian colleagues think we should do this in Gaza. There is a uniformity. This is the normal colonial voice that sort of homogenizes, and I think it is a risky argument to take. But also to talk about delivery of aid, because I do not want, and I've fallen into that trap. In frustration, one talks about all the problems, doesn't talk about the whatever good that has happened. And there are hospitals that are still, well, the past few months have been very difficult, but there are operations, hospitals, and aid that has and is being delivered by organizations that are still on the ground. The argument is not that this shouldn't be the case. The argument is what is beyond that under the circumstances, particularly and here I use the example again. I've talked to the head of mission of emergency, which is an Italian NGO, which is the single NGO that have redirected one of their search and rescue boats to go with the flotilla. And they have a clinic in Gaza. And I asked them, don't you fear for your clinic? And they said, yes, we do. And we fear for it whether we went or not. Contrast that to the position of MSF, who didn't join the flotilla, but who spoken out publicly, to that of the ICRC, who didn't join the flotilla. So the argument that this will prevent access or protect mission is very relative and not consistent. Now, I will want to ask you to please conclude. We have about 10 minutes, so 2-3 minutes each, and just tell us in practical terms, if we are sitting, if there is some of our audience who are policymakers or people who will push their leadership, what should they do? What is the next thing? And I'll start with Shahad.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Tamam. So it is clear that we're stuck in this self-referential system whereby institutional structures are taking up the space. Well, it's me, not the institution. Sorry, it's the institution, not me. It's the system, not me. And what must be realized is when a lot of people do engage in that way, we lose track of why is it that we are doing what we are doing, and what is it that we really stand up for. In very concrete terms, there are tactics to be taken. So, for example, Greenpeace has taken very good tactics across history whereby they engage directly with corporations and supported forms of direct action. This is a case of genocide where states of the global north are inherently complicit without taking up positions that directly challenge state policy in this case, while upholding and maintaining that this is actually deeply rooted in international law. We really risk losing sight. And it's very important to articulate what are the priorities at the moment. The priorities stand with taking third state responsibility forward as anchored in the ICJ decision of 2024, the July one, as well as the January one. So that means that we need states to impose arms embargo two-way. And the reason why the genocide is not stopping is because far too many states are actually buying weapons from Israel, and the buying comes with the selling. So unless we stop it both ways, including dual-use technologies, and focus our efforts on that in one way or the other, energy embargo as well, economic sanctions, unseating Israel from the United Nations, as well as seeking accountability mechanisms, the anti-apartheid mechanism, and protective presence. If protective presence were to be taken forward, we need the genuine engagement with INGOs, and their genuine engagement does really mean centering Palestinian voices. As you noted, Tamam, it is not that I spoke to a person in Palestine. It is that I respect the basic tenets of Palestinian right of self-determination when I engage. And sadly enough, as an international lawyer, I could tell you that what self-determination really means has been quite really much distorted. It is not statehood or democracy as comprehended in that very small notion. Palestinian self-determination really relies on respect their right of return, their right of reparation, their right to ending colonization as a system of apartheid, and recognizing that in its totality. So, and anchoring our understanding of that, I've published with Al-Haq a piece that tries to outline a decolonial reading of the right of self-determination, and that is the only premises that we could really, I believe, work within, which is anchoring that in everything that we do. We have enough history, we have enough law to build our premises. So telling me that this is something that is negotiable is really not a sufficient way. And if Israel says that it will only engage, so it needs information about the Palestinian staff or whatnot, these are illegal things. Take them to the courts by trying to say that, and by mishandling humanitarian access. That is a war crime. So if a state asks you of that, you don't have the duty to adhere. And if everyone does that, then Israel is yet again stuck in a position. It doesn't work with any of us. So why are we trying to please it, except for pleasing a very genocidal rhetoric that sadly most states, including the UK and the US, as well as the EU in its totality, are now complicit in genocide. So we need to really reckon with what does that mean. We are taking money, we are employed, and we are engaging with states who are directly complicit in genocide. So keep that in mind. Really listen to the work of Palestinian civil society actors. And here I'm looking at Pingo, which is a network of Palestinian organizations, PIPD, the Diplomacy Center, Al-Haq, Al-Mizan, and PCHR. I recognize that the messaging isn't always consistent, but recognize that we are really drowning, as well as Law for Palestine. However, we are giving mechanisms, we are signaling, and all of our demands and our priorities are very clear. These must be centered and put at the heart of every single discourse going forward. And of course, indeed, a direct reckoning. So I really think diversifying the tactics is the most important thing at the moment, really recognizing the economics side of it and standing upright next to the people. We find that parliamentarians don't understand the basic premises of what they're doing in relation to you. So engage with your local parliaments, engage with your local state. And not only that, whether we recognize it or not, humanitarian organizations have a lot of leverage with states. If they submit to the states, if they pressure the states, if they advocate among the states with a unified position, then we have a chance of making this reckoning happen much faster. Every single
Thank
word
you.
of truth, will take us closer to ending this genocide.
Thank you, Shahad. Thank you very much. Philip, your go, and I want to particularly prod you on, should there be a call of humanitarian actors to activate R2P or United for Peace?
Yeah. So I realized I didn't answer the Uniting for Peace question earlier, but I'm also embarrassed that there's a lawyer on the call and I'm going to try and talk about this resolution. But Uniting for Peace is a resolution in the General Assembly that allows the General Assembly to take control of the Security Council in a situation in which the Security Council is no longer able to fulfill its core mission, which is to secure peace and security. And clearly it has failed in the context of Gaza. Therefore, states who are members of the General Assembly can essentially take control of the Security Council's mandate, and that can include up to the commission of a military force under a UN flag. So historically, it was used, for example, to get around the Soviet veto. So when the UN sent an army into Korea, it was used the Uniting for Peace resolution. So there is a mechanism within the UN that allows for doing some of the sort of more military forms of intervention that some might now believe is necessary, which is the Uniting for Peace resolution. And I believe that it is time to do Uniting for Peace. I mean, it's well past time, to be honest, because clearly there should have been a military intervention to prevent genocide much, much earlier. And then, so other practical, very practical things that I think the humanitarian system can be doing is that speaking to various organizations with people on the ground, there needs to be, I think, a kind of a coherent approach to the gathering of data and evidence, because humanitarians often have things like very access to power, internet. They have the ability to be gathering evidence of war crimes, and it should be systematically gathered, collected, preserved on a single system, with that information then submitted to the ICJ and the ICC. There isn't that much. There is some attempt at systematic documenting and monitoring, but it's relatively ad hoc. So I think that, given that we see that humanitarians and aid workers are often treated as witnesses now, for instance, in the Gaza tribunal in Britain, led by Jeremy Corbyn, they were brought in as witnesses because they're one of the only perceived to be, of course, we should never downplay Palestinian voices, but seen to be the independent witnesses. So I believe it's time, and I've argued for this before in other places, that we need to start thinking about justice as a new humanitarian value, and what that means for our operations, i.e. having something like not a justice cluster, but a justice framework with people whose role is the gathering and collection of evidence in situations of genocide. And then I think that practically also humanitarian organizations need to join the siege, understanding that join the Samud and break the siege, Samud flotilla to break the siege, understanding that does not necessarily mean that they are actually going to get into Gaza, but to see that as actually a legitimate form of humanitarian action that connects to humanitarian history. When we've had to build that humanitarian space, it's often been through siege breaking. And I saw in the chat, other people have mentioned many historic examples where humanitarians have acted in ways to break sieges. And we have to be real then about the fact that illiberalism and the age of impunity is here, and the assumption that we had a protected space in which we carry out our delivery mechanisms, that is disappearing and fast. And that requires, finally, my final point is that I think humanitarians need to learn from activists, because activists have been doing this for a long time, this kind of campaign building, changing people's opinions. That, for instance, if we take Just Stop Oil, in Britain and insulate Britain, these movements you can actually trace, while they very much upset people, they actually shifted up the number of mentions of these particular causes. Activists know how to get things onto agendas and how to change public opinion. And I think that the professionalization, which has also been mentioned of the humanitarian sector, has to a certain extent limited the staff body that has those activist skills in particular. So I think that we need to become much more activist in order to rebuild humanitarian space. So those are my final thoughts. Tamam, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Philip. And Freddie, I'll give you the last comment before we close up.
A lot has been said, so I'm going to keep it really tight. And I think both Shahad and Philip have made a lot of the points that I would have done. Maybe one thing to reiterate is the point that's been made around mutual aid actors. Find the entry points, find those actors who we can work through that are outside of the system. I also see it being raised in the chat. And then finally, just a kind of more process point, trying to speak to organizations directly. I think every organization working in Gaza should have a big piece of paper in front of them with the question on top: how can I justify continuing to operate in this context under these conditions? And there should be a strategy developed in response to that question, which should be called explicitly a political strategy, which is very uncomfortable. It's not an advocacy strategy. It's not a communication strategy. It's a political strategy that says, how do we use our positionality? How do we use the leverage? How do we interrogate where we have leverage and where we have opportunities? And how do we hold ourselves to account for delivering against that strategy? And what mechanisms can we put in place to do that? And from a process perspective, I think that would be a good way to approach it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Freddie. And thank you for all those who stayed with us for the 90 minutes. I think it is fair to say that there is not enough being done. There cannot be enough done to stop a genocide. There is a responsibility, a distinct responsibility and a distinct position for a humanitarianism that is still continues to say rightly that it is a moral position in addition to being a delivery mechanism. And that occupies a space that has recognition. There is a risk in doing that, and there is a need for transparency about decisions, for taking a political position, and for acting forward. Obviously, we didn't expect to come up with a prescription on what organizations that have to do. We merely take this occasion to say that there are other options. They are wider than we have allowed ourselves to think. And in a week, we have the high-level week of the UN General Assembly, where those discussions will be had again, where Palestinians have been prevented from being present to represent themselves, where the killing will continue through meetings in New York, and where we see no end in sight. It is about time for us to look further. I apologize to all those who asked questions. I had my amazing colleagues compile a lot of the questions, and I will use them. I will deliver the questions to the panelists, and I will ask you to help us work through those as well, because this is not a conversation that ends in one day. My deep, deep gratitude to my colleagues in the New Humanitarian who make this possible every day. Please go and read the investigation by Riley Sparks on the targeting of aid seekers and the witnessing from our colleague, from journalists in Gaza, that is happening regularly. And Shahad, Philip, Freddie, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.